So, hi everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to come to this second event in the Sexualities, and Sexual Harm seminar series. So, just to introduce our research group and the seminar series first, the Sexualities, and Sexual Harm, or SSSH group, is a network of researchers who are all working towards the prevention of sexual harm and to destigmatize consensual ethical sexualities. We're based in the Department of Psychology at Leeds Beckett University, but we also have members outside Leeds Beckett and outside psychology as well. We take a creative and interdisciplinary approach in much of our work. And our core themes for the next few years are around prevention, sexual consent, and justices. So the seminar series is a way for us to platform the amazing work being done by other people in this space, to meet people, share ideas, and have meaningful and nuanced discussions about topics related to sex, sexualities, and sexual harm. So we're hoping to have speakers in the series who are not only academics, but also activists, practitioners, and artists working in the field. So recently we've had a lot of discussions as a group about the incredibly successful TV program Adolescence, and the massive impact that that's had on the cultural conversation around online misogyny and inceldom. And of course, the recent attack on the Otley Run in Headingley, which was fueled by far-right and misogynist extremism, has had an impact in our local community. And we thought it felt really timely and important that we tried to understand a bit more about that topic. And so we're really pleased to have Allysa Czerwinsky here today to speak to us about her ethnographic work in the Incelosphere. Allysa is a research fellow and PhD candidate at the University of Manchester, whose research focuses on how male supremacism and misogynist extremism manifest in digital environments. Alyssa's doctoral work explores the narratives present in the stories posted to several high-profile incel forums, with the aim of uncovering how these stories help legitimize instances of identity-based harm and provide additional knowledge about the pathways into and out of inceldom. So before I hand over Allysa, I just wanted to remind people of a couple of housekeeping things. So if anyone wants the captions on, then you can turn them on for yourselves by clicking on the three dots at the top of the screen, navigating to language and speech, and then clicking show live captions. If you could also all make sure you're on mute throughout, unless you're asking a question, that would be great. And we're going to save questions for the end, so please hold on to them. But if anything comes to mind while Allysa is speaking, then you could pop them in the chat and Margot will ask those at the end for us. Yeah, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Allysa.
Thank you so much. I meant to say it's Allysa. It happens, don't worry.
We did not worry. Your last name, but not your first, Allysa.
Do not worry. It happens all the time. I am so used to it. I just recorded a podcast and we checked the name and then all of a sudden the actual recording was Allysa. So it happens. Do not worry.
Makes sense with that spelling, actually.
Yes and no. You can blame my parents for it. But anyway, thank you so much for having me today. I wanted to give a shout out to whoever came up with the acronym for SSSH because it is fantastic and I am in love with it. As Francesca said, I am Allysa. I am both a research fellow in AI security and trust and a PhD candidate at the University of Manchester. Specifically, my PhD is in criminology. My Viva is on July 1st, so please keep me in your thoughts as I await that point in my career. But in addition to looking at misogynist inceldom and misogynist extremism, I'm also trying to look at how additional conversations are being had around AI girlfriends and AI partnerships. So if you are interested in that, stay tuned in the coming years because that's where I'm hoping to pivot and finally get out of the incel box for a little bit. So with that being said, I did want to give a little bit of the introduction to the work that I have done and the work that I've done through my doctorate. So I have over 7 years experience researching male supremacism online with a particular focus on misogynist incels. And I use that term here specifically to describe the online masculinist communities of cisgender heterosexual men who self-identify as involuntary celibates, who often adopt male supremacist views, and who at times advocate for violence. I use this to distinguish specifically between the wider term incel, which is an ascribed identity for people experiencing unwanted singlehood. Now, as Francesca said, my doctoral work predominantly explores how narratives and ideologies influence entering, participating in, and disengaging from the Incelosphere, with a particular focus on identity-based harm and dehumanization narratives within that. Specifically, I wanted to foreground my positionalities here and the approach that I take to my work. I am a cis queer white woman who engages in research on male supremacism, which has produced some very fun reflexivities and positionality statements within my work. But importantly, I take an intersectional feminist and critical criminological approach to my work, which means that while I recognize that misogynist inceldom has links to terrorism, security threats, and offline violence, a lot of what I try to focus on is the precursors to that. So things like harm and social injustice that underpin both community members' experiences specifically, but also intersect with how they enact harm against other people, including other community members and outgroup members. So, as Francesca said, misogynist incels have been at the fore of a lot of recent discussions around misogyny and male supremacism, mostly fueled by existing conversations around the dramatized portrayal of incel violence via adolescence, particularly because it focuses on youth violence and the coalition between misogyny, youth, and acts against young women. In addition, there's also been a rise of quote unquote incel ideologies and the use of community terms within educational settings that has been steadily increasing over the past few years, some of which is spurred by misogyny influencers like Sneeko, Andrew Tate, and also white supremacists like Nick Fuentes, some of which also will come from the incel community itself. And moreover, we've seen a rise within a UK context specifically in government commissions into quote unquote incel violence, such as the new incel concerns catch-all category in Prevent, which is our counterterrorism legislation. However, amidst this focus, we often see predominant discussions focusing specifically on discourses of violence, threat, and securitization. And while I'm not here to minimize those discourses because I actively engage with them in the work that I do, some of what this results in is actually obscuring the nuanced ways in which the Incelosphere prompts harm, both to its users and to outgroup members that exist beyond offline violence and security threats. And that's specifically what I want to talk to you about today. I'm aiming to unpack the interpersonal aspects that can cause harm when users engage with harmful belief systems. Before I get too deep into everything, I did want to give everybody a brief primer on the historical and contemporary nature of the incel community and the Incelosphere, which is basically a network of blogs and forums and content that shapes incel identities and allows users who self-identify as incels to engage with one another in online space. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the term incel was originally coined by a queer Canadian woman named Alana in the late 90s. In 1997, Alana, who was struggling with her own experiences of unwanted singlehood, decided to create a mailing list and a plain text HTML website that she coded herself to connect with other people who were experiencing similar issues of loneliness and unwanted singlehood. She termed it Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project, and a user in that forum initially told her that she could shorten it to incel. She wanted to call it InVcel, and then that user said, no, incel is easier to say, and the name stuck. So Alana's original community was inclusive, and the way that she defined the term incel was something that was used to describe anyone experiencing unwanted singlehood, regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation. In addition, the community was predominantly support focused. It offered resources, it offered opportunities to write in to discuss your personal experiences, both on the HTML website and the mailing list for community members that served as opportunities to connect with others. However, changes in moderation and internet culture stemming through to the early 2000s shifted the original support-focused community towards misogyny and edgy humor. This also combined with a rise in 4chan culture and the adoption of men's rights activists and pickup artist language that helped users of contemporary incel communities build worldviews and terms around their identities that differ starkly from what Alana originally conceptualized the community as. Importantly, there was an increasing focus within both the early incel community and contemporary incel communities today that holds women accountable for experiences of unwanted singlehood and rejection. In addition, new theories incorporated the color pill philosophies within other manosphere spaces. A lot of us are probably familiar with the red pill at this point, which stems from the Matrix film's choice that Neo is offered between taking the red pill and the blue pill. In the manosphere, the red pill purports to awaken men to the true nature of women, which are viewed as promiscuous, dishonest, and manipulative. It also tells men that they can achieve romantic success in a rigged dating world through adopting manipulative seduction tactics and self-improvement strategies. The Incelosphere takes this logic further, advocating for the existence of a nihilistic black pill. It's a very, very fatalist and nihilistic spin on the red pill, which ultimately presents attractiveness as the sole factor in dating and social success. In addition, the black pill supports a stratified hierarchy of attractiveness that women are said to uphold, which works to disadvantage men who are perceived as unattractive, either physically or socially. As self identified incels contemporarily view themselves as populating the bottom rung of this hierarchy, they feel unjustly victimized for being unattractive in society. This hierarchy is also something that you may be familiar with. It's stratified into idealized versions of hegemonically masculine men and women, often termed Chads, Stacys, Brads, Beckys, and your normie tier, which is basically everyone who exists above incels themselves. Importantly, this hierarchy is underpinned by racist, colonialist, and cis heteronormative views of what we consider beauty standards and attractiveness that often skew white and Eurocentric. So, importantly for my work, because I focus on ideology and narrative, I wanted to give you a bit of a background into the ideologies and narrative discussions that are happening in community spaces that help contextualize our understandings of harm. So in my work, I specifically conceptualize ideologies as per Knott and Lee's definition, where they say that ideologies are a form of thought practices that are socially meaningful, meaning that they influence how we bond with other people, they influence how we self-identify and negotiate our position as social beings, and they contribute to how we interpret and project our emotions in different spaces. This is important because this view of ideology moves beyond the idea that community members, regardless of whether they're incels or not, in wider communities as well, hold a coherent and structured worldview. We've often seen this in government responses to incel violence, where there is one worldview that members ascribe to, and my results show the opposite. It tends to be very take what you want, leave what you don't. To interpret your life experiences, which is not uncommon. We all are guilty of doing this. But the way in which this manifests in incel communities is quite unique and nuanced. In addition, this focus as thought practices allows us to consider the varied and at times very inconsistent ways that beliefs manifest in a single community. This is especially important for the Incelosphere, as thought practices are shaped by users' subjective experiences of rejection, humiliation, and victimization. Not all interpretations of those experiences are going to align 100% with common thought practices in the community, but there is some shared discourse that's important in underpinning community members' experiences. I also adopt Page's concept of shared stories in my analysis, which are key to community identity and bonding. Retelling experiences of victimhood and rejection are an essential part of online community building, both for incels themselves, but also more broadly. And the way in which we share stories also adopts narrative portrayals of the self and others, shaping how we define and how others perceive both in group and out group identities. This is like any other form of storytelling. When we recount an experience that we've had that's negative or positive, we often play up certain elements to the audience in order to garner the emotional response that we want. If we're venting, we may want sympathy and validation. If we're sharing a positive experience, we may want congratulations. And this is true across communities, but we see it in particular ways within the Incelosphere. So in building from the ideological foundations of this community, it's important to acknowledge how in-group affirmation and out-group othering happen. These processes are not necessarily unique to the incel community, as a lot of the strategies that are used tend to be true across social groups more generally, but the nuances within them are really important for contextualizing how ideology is negotiated and understood within community spaces, and how users use those thought practices to reinterpret the experiences of rejection, isolation, and unwanted singlehood that they experienced. So, theories and terminologies are an important part of incel community world building, and that's probably no surprise given how important the Black pill is to community discussions. These work to bond users by helping them interpret subjective experiences through shared thought patterns. They create in group identities through shared definitions of authentic inceldom, which helps position in group members as valued and conforming to particular standards that communities are constantly negotiating across discussions. The Black pill is one of these ways in which out-group identities and in-group identities are negotiated. It provides users with a worldview that frames inceldom as a fixed identity characteristic. It relies on biological determinism and fatalism to tell users who are in these communities that there is something innately not, I don't want to say wrong with them, but there's something innately off. And that innate biological component of inceldom, whether it's real or perceived, influences how users view the self and their identity to others in offline space as well. So oftentimes users will say, okay, I was born with this thing. There's a reason why I am so different from other people. And that makes me demonstrably different and impacts how I can relate to others in a way that normie people are just not able to understand. In community discussions, inceldom is also constructed as an immutable trait that importantly makes self-improvement or accessing romance or sex impossible. It can be done, and oftentimes users are chomping at the bit to change their life circumstances, but the nihilism and fatalism that underpins communities' ideologies and also community discussions means that there's this constant push and pull between wanting to change, but also feeling like change is worthless. I think this is best exemplified by this quote here from one of the users in my data set. If you're ugly, relationships are just not possible. It's as simple as that. For an incel, celibacy is a permanent state of being. That's just how it is, and we have no control over that. You can feel the resignation to that identity there. And this quote really cements the fact that they view this as a fixed identity. Even though self-improvement is often levied at incel communities of like general advice of, oh, go take a shower, work on your social skills, a lot of this falls on deaf ears because communities are socialized into feeling that their identities are not amenable to change. Importantly, boundaries around authentic inceldom are supported by scientific truth. I use this in quotes here because there is some use of empirical science, but users will often rely on pseudoscience, including studies from evolutionary psych that have long been disproven and often deliberately misinterpret statistics to support the biological basis of inceldom while also affirming their negative experiences of romantic rejection. They're also used to justify othering outgroup members, predominantly women. We often see in community forums, particularly the main forum, that users will compile lengthy lists of evidence, such as compilations of height pills, of race pills, of women being degenerate, which often includes sources that run the gamut of being trustworthy science to anecdotal evidence that is published by far-right blogs. While the trustworthiness and credibility of these sources differ, they all work in the same way and are presented as equal evidence of incels' subjugation and inherent victimization in society. They construct a very accessible evidence base within the community where users can go, see, I'm not wrong. I'm not crazy. This is grounded in objective science. They also talk about the empirical basis of lookism, which is a preference for attractive, predominantly Eurocentric white features over what users perceive themselves having. And this often incorporates evoseg studies and studies around selection science as well. Importantly, this provides an evidence base for users to help reinterpret their experiences of rejection and isolation, which bolsters objective science with subjective experiences, making it really difficult to counter. These help them reinterpret their own offline experiences by allowing them to access relatively easily all of this information that says, look, you have a right to feel different. In addition, the Black Pill offers a predefined cast of in and out group characters, along with convincing explanations of life events framed as logical, observable truths. This same evidence is further used to support outgroup difference and dehumanization, predominantly towards women through a tactic of evidence-based misogyny, where knowledge is used to affirm essentialist narratives about women and male incels' victimization at the hands of them. I want to note here that while women as a general gender identity are often targeted within community forums, there are important differences in how specific identities of women are targeted in differential ways. Predominantly, users will target racial and ethnic minority women with aggressive, racist, and misogynoirist rhetoric. They will target neurodiverse women with eugenics-based rhetoric and also hold them accountable for spreading inceldom in men. Queer folks are also particularly dehumanized within forums. Sapphic identities, lesbians and bisexual women are also told that they do not exist or that their sexuality is a ruse to repel ugly men. And importantly, trans women, particularly trans women of color, are often depicted through community memes as wanting to be hung or killed through violent ends. Now, while much of this rhetoric impacts women as a whole, there are important differences that I want to be aware of because they're not really touched on this in this presentation, but I do account for them in my other research. So in addition to all of these sort of world building elements and how users define themselves in relation to outgroups, there's also differences in how authentic inceldom is performed correctly within community spaces. Literature often presents inceldom as a homogenous identity, but authenticity is repeatedly performed and constantly surveilled and judged by other users. True inceldom or true seldom hinges on being perceived as the most subordinate by other community members through combinations of characteristics believed to disadvantage men both socially and in dating. These often include characteristics such as race, ethnicity, neurodiversity, height, weight, and physical appearance, along with a whole host of other subjectivities and characteristics that users will list in their self-descriptions. For instance, one user describes himself as a kissless, hugless, handholdless virgin, true cell, a frame cell, which basically is talking about how his body appears, predominantly the trunk of his body, a wrist cell, which is saying, the width of his wrist is below average for what would be expected with hegemonic masculine standards. He's mixed race, who has a repelling asymmetrical face and mild body deformity. I don't know what he means by mild body deformity, but you can sort of see the tone in how he presents his identity to the community. It is attacking on of a barrage of identity characteristics that are both important to him as an individual, but that also put him closer to true self status. Even though he uses the term true self in this identity, all of these added frames are community signifiers of true, authentic inceldom, while also positioning his identity to other users as worthy of being considered as part of the community. In addition, like this comment, users often emphasize characteristics associated with true seldom in their posts, hoping to be validated as unjustly disadvantaged and victimized. This helps afford sympathy from other users in discussion forums. For instance, saying that you are 5'3" in height as a man can get you regarded as being brutal as fuck. I'm 5'6" hobbit, but at 5'3", I just KMS, which is slang for I'd kill myself. That, even though that feels quite aggressive in a response, for community members, that is validating. To have those experiences be discussed and for something like height to be recognized as limiting is really important because a lot of times community members feel that these characteristics and subjectivities are ignored in mainstream discussions of attractiveness. In addition, for users who occupy multiple axes of true seldom, being perceived as the lowest of the low creates a paradoxical sense of status. While this subjugation limits opportunities for social status in mainstream society, it helps afford them respect and value within community spaces. Moreover, users who fail to align with authentic inceldom are maligned as fake cells or volcells, basically that they are fake incels, or they are voluntary celibates and not truly involuntary celibates, with validation of personal experiences rescinded for users who are sussed out to be fake or inauthentic. For instance, these comments demonstrate that. These are from two separate posts on one specific forum where somebody had claimed true cell identity and someone responded to him by saying, "You can tell you're not an incel, your face isn't even that ugly." The second quote here was from a story about somebody who exited the community via Ascension, and it was later found out that he was white. And somebody said, "You're a 6 foot white guy. You didn't put yourself out there enough unless you live in Bumblefuck USA." So in that post, he was talking about, I finally got out, but I had all these negative experiences and I couldn't get with women in the past. And that comment was specifically in response to that part, saying that he didn't put himself out there enough because whiteness is associated in community spaces with having an easier time of accessing both social and romantic success. In addition, users create distance between themselves and those perceived as inauthentic, doubling down on narratives of biological determinism and fatalism to perform their inceldom correctly. Now, given all of this backdrop to how communities negotiate their identities within the Incelosphere, when we think about exiting the community, it's quite a complicated process, predominantly because the thought processes and competitions to be viewed as authentically incel really create dissonance and ideological messiness for community members when they're trying to escape these situations. The community's focus on performing authentic inceldom signals problems for disengagement, predominantly because the repeated self denigration and focusing, almost hyperfixating on fixed characteristics, cements inceldom as a permanent trait rather than a temporary state. Going back to Alana's original definition of the term, she conceptualized involuntary celibacy as something that was not a lifelong condition. It was a temporary experience. You were going through something, you needed support to get through it, and eventually you would get out of it, as Alana herself did a few years after founding the community. However, in contemporary incel communities, this rhetoric has noticeably shifted towards something permanent and continually afflicting users. Moreover, the scientific black pill provides an evidence base of proof to help confirm and cement this identity as something that is fixed and unamenable to change. However, these definitions are inherently at odds with how community members frame exiting inceldom through ascension, which is often referred to in community circles as acquiring a romantic or sexual partner. Logically, given that involuntary celibacy is essentially unwanted virginity or unwanted singlehood, a lack of romantic relationships despite desiring one, having sex or finally achieving dating success technically ends your involuntary celibate identity. You are no longer an incel because you have acquired the thing that you were no longer able or you were previously unable to get. However, um, the concept of ascension is also really heavily linked to pseudoscientific theories about dating success, rating scales, and self improvement strategies that help users increase their desirability. Again, something that is predominantly at odds with the body of literature that presents inceldom as a fixed and unchangeable trait. Importantly, users talk about ascension a lot, and that's probably not surprising given that they are experiencing unwanted singlehood, are upset with their status, and the only way that they see getting out of an incel identity is through achieving romantic or sexual success. However, across conversations, ascension means different things to different users, which is important to highlight in forthcoming discussions. For some users, their definition of ascension is explicitly tied to sex and virginity loss, and that tracks given how they conceptualize their inceldom as something that is involuntary and revolves around celibacy. However, others viewed ascension as something that was self-improvement based, that helped them improve the likelihood of finding and keeping romantic partners. One such self-improvement tactic is called geomaxing, which is basically arguing that your inceldom is due to where you live, predominantly by saying that if you are in a Western white country, there is an overabundance of attractive white men, and that you should move to more disadvantaged or less white nations in order to improve your chances at ascension. This is exemplified in one quote from the main forum here that tells users in his guide to Ascension that they will have more leverage in other countries, especially if they are average in their own country, like some people say they are here, then you will be above average in Southeast Asian countries, for example. You will be seen as niche over there instead of an abundance of males in the West. I want to highlight here that this rhetoric is steeped in colonialist notions of white superiority and white supremacy, and also hits on community lore, presenting the white male, Asian female dynamic as a very important aspect of Ascension for white male users. I don't have time to get into that today. It is not the most positive thing to talk about, but I want to make that clear that this is an explicitly racist and colonialist suggestion. In addition, users who do manage to ascend through relationships or sex often choose to abandon their accounts, as this change essentially precludes them from now claiming authentic inceldom. I've seen this in a lot of exiting stories across two of the subreddits that I looked at for my PhD. Several users who had gotten a date had then said, well, this precludes me from being here because now I have a chance out. Other users had left after they had engaged in virginity loss or sexual encounters, saying that now they were no longer celibate. However, other users waited still until they had a solid relationship that had been going on for quite a while, and they felt confident to then rescind their incel identity. One of these experiences was from this user here, who we're going to come back to in a bit, but he had initially had he met somebody through an incel-specific subreddit that was focused on dating at the time. This was quite a few years now. A lot of the subreddits have now been banned, predominantly because they have violated Reddit's harassment policies. But at the time, this incel dating subreddit was active. He met a genderqueer individual on there. They exchanged contact information. They met offline. The encounter went well. And then he had said, you know, there's not an opportunity for a relationship here, but there is opportunity for future sex. And because I have this option now, I will be abandoning this account today. And he goes on, this was quite a lengthy post, but he ends his post by saying it would be disingenuous to stay and keep identifying as an incel. For him, loss of virginity and that promise of future sex with this one person was enough to say, okay, I'm out now. That this has fixed me. I have gone beyond this fixed identity characteristic. I am now no longer an incel. I am out of the community and I can no longer be in this space. Other user stories center the importance of interpersonal connection. So where some often talked about virginity loss and sex or romance as the most important thing just to acquire it, to get over the stigma of not having it, a lot of users said that it's not necessarily about sex or romance, it's about what those things mean and what leverage they give in society. This was important for users who thought that romance and sex were not just an end goal, but that they were precursors to intimacy, vulnerability, and establishing trust and support with another person. This was particularly important for users in combating the loneliness of inceldom, alongside helping them work through the initial variables and experiences that had led them to join the community, predominantly experiences of bullying, rejection, and isolation from both male and female peers. For some, this helped establish a sense of normalcy. One user described that a relationship, a hookup, or sex with a sex worker would counter his feelings of being broken and left out in the dust. Other users also talked about this, saying that now when they went to work or when they were with friends, they had something to talk about. For them, romance, intimacy, and desire were a form of social capital. They were able to be included in conversations that they had long been excluded from. This is particularly important because communities often distinguish between themselves as virgins and non-virgins, presenting a sort of the uncrossable divide where the experiences that their coworkers or peers had when they talked about sex or relationships were just so foreign that they couldn't even engage. Moreover, they weren't invited to events because it was a couples thing and they didn't want, that person to feel awkward. Or when people were talking about one night stands and their sexual encounters, users felt really uncomfortable because they had nothing to share. They had no option to engage in normal life. And this was important in sort of giving them a ticket towards normalcy. In addition, perhaps most importantly, the idea of reciprocated desire was commonly discussed across stories as it was seen as a direct counter to the Black pill's nihilism. I really like this quote from this user. This was from a long, long, long post talking about a fantasy of finally being able to connect with a woman as a heterosexual man. And it really hits home the fact that for some users, sex and romance are not just about those things, acquiring those things, but it's about what it means and it's about being wanted. So he says, could you imagine how it must feel after years of sadness because of not being lusted after for a woman to come up to me and want to have sex with me? For the first time in my life, I'd be able to go, hey, I'm not as ugly as all those people who laughed at me said I was. I just had sex. So surely I can't be that detestable, right? There's a lot to unpack in this quote, and I do it in my thesis, so I won't get into it here. But you can see how those elements of sadness, isolation, and not feeling desired by prospective partners are a pain for this user. And the prospect of having somebody desire them back, having somebody want them, having somebody actively initiate consensual sex with them is so life changing, regardless of whether that actual moment will live up to the fantasy. The fantasy itself is important in imbuing sex, romance, intimacy, and desire as something that is necessary to engage with other people through connection. While this is good, some of it is good, I do want to problematize a lot of discussions that present ascension as the straightforward route or true route out of inceldom. Now, community discussions of desire, intimacy, and sex as a valid means of exiting are inherently at odds with how thought practices operate in community spaces. Think back to that discussion of ideology that we had, where the black pill presents inceldom as a fixed identity, right? It is permanent, it is a genetically predetermined trait that is unamenable to change. However, ascension as a process constructs inceldom as a temporary state, one that can be changed through acquiring romantic or sexual success. There is a noticeable mismatch between how users view themselves as incels and how they understand the transformative process that desire, sex, and intimacy may serve for their lives. Moreover, users also construct intimacy and desire as a wholly transformative experience. And while this is great in a fantasy sense, it places an enormous amount of expectation on the positive of dating and relationships, while not really letting users account for what happens when relationships inadvertently end up dissolving, being messy, or harmful. This mismatch can leave users ill prepared to handle the realities of romantic and sexual relationships, which, as we know, can be fleeting, unsatisfying, and sometimes harmful and abusive. And when users are faced with these sort of incongruencies between how they view their inceldom and the prospect and normalcy that Ascension can provide, it can result in them reverting back to a reliance on past harmful beliefs, particularly male supremacist thought practices. And it helps them confirm the inevitability of the black pill. Even though they've tried to get out of this space, it provides another subjective experience that adds layers onto the already very, very compact evidence base that surrounds the ideologies underpinning these communities. I wanted to flag this quote from one of the non-incel users in my data set, because I think they state exactly what I'm trying to articulate quite well. What happens if, after having sex, you don't get the intimacy you're looking for? What if it's a short-lived thing and you're quickly back to being an incel without the confidence or emotional skills to deal with that? A focus on ascension leaves the flawed worldview intact and just tries to move you to a different status within that same worldview. I think that's an important way to conceptualize it. And I really appreciate this user for giving such a succinct summary of what I've tried to articulate in an entire chapter of my PhD, predominantly because just focusing on the transformative aspect of desire and romance and sex doesn't really negate the individual circumstances that have led people to be part of the community. While it may temporarily influence, self-worth, lessen loneliness, make you feel good, it may alleviate mental health symptoms, it doesn't really fix any of that, even though it may do it in the short term. Moreover, the focus on ascension does not get rid of the gender essentialism, the nihilism, the fatalism, and the male supremacy, along with racism, white supremacy, transphobia, queerphobia, ableism, that underpin community ideologies. So you're sort of just putting a band-aid over a wider issue that interacts with systemic social injustices. And this is perhaps best examined or best exemplified by user discussions themselves as they work through exiting communities. Now, it goes without saying that exiting any harmful community is often a non-linear process, and extremism literature has shown this time and time again. There's often fluctuations, it's not a clear path. However, the non-linearity of exiting inceldom is further disrupted by a focus on ascension as a true exit from the community. Sex, desire, and romance didn't counter the ideologies that users had so heavily relied on to reinterpret their past rejections or harm. And as such, users who did face struggles when they were trying to exit through relationship dissolution or cheating or other aspects, messy aspects of relationships, struggled to cope without turning back to these beliefs to make sense of those negative experiences. I want to come back to the user that I had flagged who had rescinded his account and said that he was no longer part of the community. And I want to note the pseudonym change here. When I talked about him earlier, I had coded him as E, which is my sort of pseudonym for exiting. But when I saw him again a few months later, I had to change the code to C, predominantly because he was now an active member in the forum that he said he had left. While he had initially described his exit positively and said he was abandoning his account today after having sex with his genderqueer partner, he came back to the forums a few months later, spurred by his genderqueer partner coming out as a transgender man. This in itself is not a bad thing, and I want to reiterate that. However, his response to this relied on biological notions of sex and misogynist rhetoric, as well as transphobic rhetoric, which I'm not going to reproduce here. However, after their partner told them that, they are coming out as a trans person and are no longer willing to sort of engage with him because, desires change, identities change, they're constantly in flux. They also revealed that they had met somebody new. And for this user, the perceived betrayal by a person who was assigned, feminine sex at birth, while also sort of going away from the gender that he thought they were, even though they were gender nonconforming to begin with, and ending up with another partner was a catalyst for him to return to the forums. He said in a very lengthy post that he should have known better than to get his hopes up. Though he was no longer technically an incel because he's now had sex, he stated that he ended up sticking around because they, the incel community, are right. Nothing else had changed since he had had that sexual encounter. I don't have a girlfriend, and I'll be celibate again soon. In addition, his post exemplifies a rebound to viewing inceldom as a fixed characteristic due to the circumstances that initially prompted his entry into the community remaining the same. That one encounter was not enough to counter the ideological underpinnings of why he was in the community and why he continued to participate in these spaces. Importantly, there are a variety of ways in which interpersonal harms manifest as a byproduct of ascension. Negative experiences with intimacy, sex, and romance caused confusion and hurt across my dataset, which often prompted a reliance on black pill thought practices. Users struggled to cope in situations that confirmed women were callous, manipulative, or promiscuous, often relying on evidence-based misogyny that they had shirked by exiting the community to explain their negative experiences. I want to be clear here that there are some instances of abuse from women at the hands of women within my data set, But oftentimes, these were just regular rejections where a miscommunication happened, people fall out of love, people decide that it's a one night stand, I'm not interested anymore. Common experiences were then reinterpreted as signs of women's inherently devious and duplicitous nature in line with Black pilled thinking. In addition, users viewed sex and romance as life altering, and this created harm in encounters with partners who held different views or who had prior sexual experience. This was especially salient for heterosexual incel men who were in relationships with cisgender heterosexual women partners. Despite leaving the community a year earlier, one of the users in my dataset continued to rely on Incelosphere thought practices as he came back to the community to receive advice. My girlfriend is quite promiscuous, with a body count I believe is above 20. I think about it during sex, which makes it not fun for me. She conceptualizes sex as just a fun activity, whereas for me, it was a mythical golden goose. He goes on to describe how he resents her view of sex, that she is privileged, that she could access a resource for him that was so difficult to engage with. And rather than addressing any of these feelings with her, at least from the tone of his post, he comes back to a reliance on black pilled narratives around her duplicitousness, her promiscuity, without talking through his feelings with her and attempting to get validation from other users that says, yeah, you are right. She's a whore. Users also believed that any sex would fix inceldom, which often spurred risky encounters and harmful relationship practices. For one user, he described a period of hypersexuality as a result of needing to fill my deep insecurity and some contrived need to catch up. He describes deeply regretting this phase because not only did it result in a pregnancy scare, but it also caused me to cheat on my first 3 girlfriends, something I am deeply ashamed of. Other users reported relying on manipulative red pill tactics to control their partners in romantic relationships after they had exited the community. One user's use of protest behavior was often used to seek validation. Protest behavior is a common approach within the manosphere, but also in intimate relationships more generally, although the manosphere has given it a different name. It's basically sort of ignoring your partner to make sure that they actually still want you. And he describes doing this in a variety of ways. He would say something nasty and then leave her to deal with the ramifications of that, turn off his phone. He would drop like a text saying, yeah, I'm going to leave you, and then just disappear, which is emotional and psychological abuse, full stop. But to him, he had sort of interpreted that behavior as necessary for her to prove that she continually loved him, that he needed that constant reassurance. And while that is an innate human desire to need affirmation from your partner that they care about you, that they want you, that they desire you, the way that this manifests relied on long-standing tactics that are common within both incel communities specifically, but in the misogynist manosphere more generally. He describes, I would ignore her texts and calls to see if she cared about me. I made it into this mental competition only I knew about. However, after she ended up breaking up with him because of this behavior and hearing that his former partner was now in a new relationship, he came back to the subreddit to say that while he loves her, he fucking despises her and hopes that the other dude breaks her heart. And then tacks on to the end of his response to say, I almost fell back into red pill and men going their own way ideologies these past couple of days. This disconnect from how his tactics throughout the relationship and the way in which he speaks about his ex-partner while positioning himself as still exiting the Incelosphere is problematic because he's not aware that these tactics are still influencing how he's engaging with his romantic partner. Moreover, users' shared stories demonstrate the harms that can arise from conflating ascension with exiting. This can include putting the self in risky situations or experiencing and sometimes accepting abusive and harmful treatment. In addition, this also may mean perpetuating abusive and harmful treatment against current and prospective partners and using manipulative tactics to receive validation and confirm reciprocated desire. The messy nature of intimate relationships is inherently at odds with how sex, romance, and desire are understood in community spaces as a wholly transformative experience. And importantly, this means that this approach of viewing Ascension as the only way of exiting is not necessarily the healthiest, and I'm sure you can see why. However, my research and existing literature on exiting communities has demonstrated that nuanced and multifaceted approaches to exiting are needed to counter the thought practices that sustain community involvement, including the overwhelming focus on Ascension as a final endpoint or the necessary endpoint to inceldom. This includes things like bolstering agency and self-worth for individual users before they even feel motivated to counter the ideologies that they were steeped in. It also includes unpicking the logic of the black pill and reframing uncertainty in dating as a normal shared experience. And most importantly, promoting accountability for misogynist and male supremacist beliefs that underpin the communities that these members are part of, and also often actively contribute to, both within their active participation in the community and as they work through their exiting processes. Now, with that being said, while there is a lot of literature coming out around positive approaches to exiting the Incelosphere, we've also seen a preoccupation with the focus on acquiring sex and romance as a valid therapeutic approach for communities who are trying to exit the Incelosphere. As misogynist incels have inadvertently captured public attention as of late, increasing guidance has centered on reproducing community members' claims that Ascension is a true exit from inceldom. Take recent guidance from the Organization for the Prevention of Violence, which states that helping clients form intimate relationships, sexual or non-sexual, can be an important step in negating this desire for dominance. I want to be very clear that I am not a therapeutic practitioner. I am an extremist researcher and a criminologist. But as a person who has had their own struggles with intimacy and desire, as a lot of us have, maybe this may not be the best thing to suggest to somebody who has longstanding beliefs about dominance, control, subordination, and weaponized victimhood. While dating coaches and encouraging people to engage in sexual and non-sexual romantic relationships with the opposite sex is important for getting heterosexual men out of these communities, it is definitely not the first step that we should go for in our support approaches. Moreover, the Times published this. I caught this on my LinkedIn page. Do not subscribe to the Times, so apologies for not including a screenshot of the article. But this was their post on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, saying that incels should be offered dating coaches, a world-leading expert on misogynistic subculture has said. Andrew Thomas, who is an evolutionary psychologist and based at the University of Swansea, as well as the author of the largest global study into incels by the Commission for Countering Extremism, said that relationship coaching could help incels shed their misogynistic ideology. Not only do I have a problem with the platforming of evopsych narratives and the results of the Commission for Countering Extremism report that the government has now been using to treat incels as predominantly a mental health concern rather than something that is deeply enmeshed with a variety of different injustices and social structures that are contributing to loneliness and isolation across the globe. The important thing here is that the incel community sort of came about in the 2014s as a response to pickup artist culture and the seduction-based dating coaches that users themselves felt were not applicable to their lived experiences. This inadvertently suggests that we should essentially force users to engage with the communities that they were born out of because of their dissatisfaction with their focus on sexual success and rigging the game or rigging the hierarchy against or to sort of be in their favor. This also aligns with a lot of manipulative dating strategies that are common within pickup artist communities and masculinist seduction communities like the red pill. And I'm slightly concerned that this is the approach that is being platformed to helping users who have a variety of different needs, as well as who have demonstrated alignments with male supremacism and misogynist ideology, to just say, oh yeah, give them a dating coach, that'll be enough. In line with this, I don't know if anybody has been keeping up with Channel 4's Virgin Island. Full transparency, I tried to watch the first episode and I couldn't get through it. My partner and I thought that it would be like a really chill sort of thing to watch and almost like Love Island for virgins, which feels like a really weird thing to say. I'm so sorry if this is the first time you're hearing about this, but I promise it has scope for this discussion. So basically, as I was watching it, and I want to stress that I've watched probably about the first 15 minutes of it, so I'm not sure how the show changes. So please take this with a grain of salt. The voiceovers from the 12 participants who were selected to take part in this island experiment to help them overcome their virginity describe common social and personal experiences that underpin why they are still virgins at a variety of different ages. They range from sort of early 20s to 30s as the oldest. So it's predominantly a millennial and Gen Z sample, which I might add, those ages are completely normal to still be a virgin or experiencing difficulties in the dating sphere, especially today. So across users' voiceovers and talking head segments, they described loneliness, repeated bullying and rejection, even from peers, geographical isolation, and a focus on needing to make ends meet through working multiple jobs that left them unable to form connections with other people. There was one girl within this show who just sort of pulled at my heartstrings because she felt so down about her appearance because throughout her teenage life, she was referred to as the Duff in her friend group. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, it was popularized in a movie a few years ago, but it basically is an acronym for the dumb, ugly, fat friend. And that rhetoric has stayed with her, even though that was something that happened in her teen years. Now, in her early 20s, she cannot divorce that perception of herself from the comments that her friends at the time had made about her. And all of this matters because a lot of these experiences map onto what users of the Incelosphere are talking about in terms of their own experiences. Regardless of how they're distorted through different ideologies, many of these experiences are grounded in real emotive experiences with harm, rejection, and isolation. However, instead of addressing these unmet needs, the show's first episode emphasizes the participants' need to engage in physical intimacy with others, offering surrogates and therapists to support this. In the first episode, as users have sort of, or not users, as participants have sort of done their talking heads, you learn a little bit more about them. You then cut to these two sex therapists, two women sex therapists who are middle-aged or like, approaching middle age. We're not the same age as the people that they are trying to help, who are then encouraging them to watch a very intense sexual display between one of the therapists and one of the surrogates. And a lot of participants are very clearly uncomfortable. And it just sort of throws them into the deep end, going, here, look, it's because you're scared of sex. It's not because you may have all these unmet needs. It's because you need to like lighten up a little bit. And again, these are the first 15 minutes. So if you have watched the whole thing, I'm excited to hear from you to see if it gets any better. But I wanted to flag this write up from The Independent as well. Nice title there. And I wanted to read you this paragraph because I think it's very illustrative of what the show is about. In the very first episode of Channel 4's Virgin Island, 28-year-old virgin Zach finds himself irrepressibly horny. He immediately pushes past the bulk of his intimacy issues with the help of his, quote, surrogate partner, Kat, who is described as a, quote, highly trained therapist who is able to have sex with a client. Sure, okay. Zach strokes Kat's arm. In return, she lasciviously eyes him as though he were Tom Hardy bulging out a white t-shirt. This stroking is enough to fill the room with sexual tension, to assure an audience of the palpable clamminess of Zach's uninitiated brow. The voiceover lady says what we're all thinking. The speed of the surrogate program doesn't seem to be moving fast enough for Zach. This man, a virgin, and surely not for lack of willing, is ready to go. I don't know about you, but that made me feel slightly uncomfortable as somebody who's trying to move away from leaving the experience of unwanted singlehood to sex and sex alone. And I think a lot of what I see in how this has been approached in how Channel 4 has constructed Virgin Island, again, those first 15 minutes of it, mirrors what I see misogynist incels trying to do as they exit. They throw themselves headfirst into sexual intimacy and romance, thinking that it is a catch-all solution, this wholly transformative experience that will fix all of the underlying issues that they come to these communities with. I don't want to insinuate that any of the people on this program are affiliated with the incel community more broadly, but there are definitely overlaps in experiences of unwanted singlehood that map onto the same experiences that users within the Incelosphere are reporting. Whether or not those reported experiences of victimization are perceived or actual. That's not really the point. They feel that something is different about them. There is a disadvantage that they are acutely aware of. And it seems like sex is presented as this one thing that can alleviate that. But across user stories, that's far from true, especially given how messy relationships are. And not to go into all of the ethical issues with sort of putting a person who's never had an intimate relationship before with a therapist who cannot reciprocate that desire. That desire is performative. With users across the Incelosphere, they also talk about engaging in sort of contacting sex workers, paying for OnlyFans content. And oftentimes they describe how this doesn't negate a lot of the experiences of isolation, loneliness, and longing for connection that underpin their experiences of involuntary celibacy. And I get the same sense with this program as well, where it's just essentially putting another band-aid over a variety of injustices and wounds that community members come to experience as they identify and participate within unwanted singlehood communities online. So, concluding thoughts to wrap all this up. While overcoming virginity is important for many, the focus on sexual intimacy does not really address the feelings that intersect with or life experiences preceding unwanted singlehood. These same issues are reflected in the Incelosphere alongside other communities for single people online, such as Forever Alone, Forever Alone 30 Plus, Forever Alone Women, Female Dating Strategy, specific communities for queer incels and trans incels who have differential experiences of navigating singlehood as visible queer people. Countering the thought practices at the heart of misogynist inceldom, alongside addressing the intersecting issues that facilitate entry into and participation within the Incelosphere, are both really important parts of building healthier relationships with intimacy and desire. Most importantly, a holistic approach to exiting, which doesn't just focus on acquiring sex or romance alone, helps protect both users and their prospective partners from the harms of viewing sex as a singular and wholly transformative experience. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that was helpful and made sense. I'm really excited to answer any questions that you may have. So have at it.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Allysa. Super insightful, interesting, confronting. Yeah, it was amazing. I've got lots of thoughts pinging around, a couple of maybe questions, but I'm going to let other people come in first and ask their questions. We've got just shy of 25 minutes, which is great. So I'm sure we can have a good discussion now. So if anyone wants to come in, it'd be good if you could use the hands up function so we can sort of field the questions. Yeah, Karen, do you want to go?
Hi, yeah, thanks. That was amazing, Lisa. Really, like, so informative. I feel like I was just doing so much nodding.
I was going to say hi. I've not met you in person yet. Hello.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I know. It's nice to see your face. I guess my question is, as someone who has moved from research, is a researcher, but also a practitioner in this field, and I'm now working a lot more with young people. And one of my main concerns has always been how you know, not just inceldom, but lots of the other kind of misogynistic content we see online, how it feeds into and affects relationships amongst young people. I get asked a lot of times, sometimes by parents, sometimes by carers and other professionals, where are the soft ramps to send young men to when they're displaying problematic or, you know, worrying ideologies or belief systems about women. And at the moment I've just hit a wall and I can't find anywhere to refer them to that falls before, you know, it becoming a prevent kind of issue. So I just wondered if you had an answer to that, or if it's depressingly that there isn't one.
I fear my answer is going to be depressingly that there isn't anything. And I think this is something that I've grappled with predominantly because a lot of the focus at present has been on young people, but my samples tend to skew older. So what I've just tangentially, what I've noticed is within exiting forums, the younger, bless them, the younger users will log on when they're about 15, maybe 14. I think 14 is the youngest that I have in my sample. And they'll say, I'm an incel, I can't have sex, nobody wants me, like I'm being bullied at school, and all of these are valid concerns. And then they'll come back a few years later and go, here's my experience as a former community member, as a 16-year-old who now has a girlfriend. And it's very like, I don't want to minimize those experiences because they are so hard to navigate for young people growing up in today, but also growing up predominantly online with all the messaging that they get. It's almost as natural aging out of inceldom that you sort of expect. You're like, oh, maybe they've gone to university, they've met people, they've left their hometown, they found new groups of friends. They're no longer in, sixth form with all the people that they grew up around who they're not maybe attracted to, and everyone just knows them as like an inside joke or a name for them. Whereas I find I struggle quite a lot with the older users who come on who are maybe mid to late 20s, early 30s, late 30s, early 40s, who have such differential experiences of navigating this, and there's nowhere to send them that is not prevent. And I think one of the struggles that I have as somebody who's sort of, I straddle the line between like an extremism researcher and somebody who's actively critiquing how extremism research functions. Don't get me wrong, there's some fantastic research out there, some fantastic critical research, but a lot of it tends to go, ooh, security threat, and then let's deal with this through counterterrorism legislation. So for young people specifically, I think there's a bit of a focus on school programs. From what I know, there isn't anything active, which is quite a problem because when you think about delivering interventions in school, it's often a one-day thing. It has to be sort of structured around student schedules. They need to fit it in. There's no prolonged contact. So even though you may be giving them some skills, you can't actually continually engage. There's also not a lot of like third spaces for young people in the online sphere, which I know I'm sort of dating myself here, but when I was online in like the early / mid to late 2000s, we had like spaces. Like I was on Club Penguin, I was making friends. It was not the safest. I was on Omegle, but there's a lot of platforms now that are inherently risky, are inherently profitable, and are being used to inundate young people with harmful messaging because it gets money, it gets clicks, it gets attention. So if you think about misogyny influencers gearing their content toward young people, Andrew Tate is especially guilty of this. Aiden Ross is another one, Nick Fuentes to a certain extent, as well as the rise of alt tech platforms that are not really being moderated. You've got all these sort of aggressive spaces that kids and young people can access, but you don't have an alternative to any of this. Young kids are on TikTok, they are on Instagram, but there's nothing that's really filtering them away from more adult content within these spaces. Especially on TikTok, you can just sort of end up in some place that you don't want to be. It's happened to me as well. I think what I've predominantly seen is more text-based guidance from nonprofits and NGOs that is aimed at parents in trying to get parents to understand certain communities and ideologies that may be risk factors. But I also think at this point, there's so much cross-pollination between mainstream misogyny influencers and what was predominantly in fringe spaces, where now 4chan, 8chan, Gab, Rumble content is being platformed on Twitter, through Meta platforms, also on TikTok, as Anda's work demonstrates as well. So unfortunately, the answer is sort of there's nothing. And I think one of the reasons is that there's a lack of just care around regulating and providing these spaces for young people. But there's also this overwhelming pressure on schools to be tasked with responding to this when we are drastically slaughtering the education systems across the world. Even in the UK, Canada's guilty of it too. And there's this expectation that, yeah, teachers are meeting it in the classroom, so they should respond. But they have their own, they have a workload that they are getting underpaid for, that they do not have the bandwidth to respond to. The same is for older users. While there may be sort of, if they're in university, there may be positive spaces that they can go, student unions, student groups. There's not really anything that's geared towards countering a lot of the main misogyny that's existing in society. And part of me is like, how do we counter it when it's so embedded in all of our discourse? We see politicians platforming. You see Elon Musk getting the world's largest platform and being invited to places and profiting off of that. You see Andrew Tate being allowed to be in the US to start his political party in the UK. And there's really no ramifications for any of this speech, which makes it really difficult to tell young people, hey, this is actually, it's harmful, because they don't feel that it is, even though us as researchers and as practitioners can go, you're hurting yourself, you're hurting others, please come out of it. There just unfortunately isn't anything out there. I'll keep you updated in case I see anything. I think the only resource in the UK that's like facilitating conversations is Kathy from Tooled Up, but I know that her stuff is also behind a paywall, which is not the most accessible. It is valid to have it behind a paywall because she's, you know, an NGO, a nonprofit. But as far as I know, there's nothing that's sort of grassroots at present. But I will keep you updated if I see anything.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We have a few questions in the chat. So Becky wrote, thank you so much for this talk. It's so interesting and important. I have a few questions. One, you said that the ideology was about seeing themselves as inherently different to normies, quote unquote normies. Do you think there is a high proportion of autistic men who are incels because they genuinely are different and often don't fit in?
Yes, thanks, Becky. I'll address the other two questions that you've asked as well. So I struggle with discussions around neurodiversity in the community, predominantly because Manassian, who is the Toronto van attacker, I'm from Toronto, I'm acutely familiar with that case, tried to weaponize his autism as a defense for a misogynist act of violence. And I'm aware that community members have a complicated relationship to neurodiversity within forums, both for themselves as users, but also for other people who are neurodiverse, that they don't view them as the same, even though they share similarities in their neurodiversities. I think autism more broadly can definitely intersect with experiences of unwanted singlehood. And I know it does intersect with inceldom for a lot of people. It doesn't necessarily intersect with the misogynist branch of inceldom all the time. But the rhetoric is still quite the same, right? There's this feeling of difference, but it's slightly nuanced in how autistic users speak about it. For them, the difference is that they are often, or they describe being unaware of the norms around heterosexual dating, that they feel the pressure to conform to, if they are cishet men, to ask women out, but then feel that they are lacking the social skills to do that and they don't really know how to approach it. Whereas there are other users who will talk about how society views their autism as something as a disadvantage as well. And that sort of can feed into individuals' own experiences of how they live with their neurodiversities. It's similar to ADHD. I see less discussions about ADHD than autism in community spaces, I think because it's quite prevalent in existing discourse right now, and also a common part of sort of confirming the science, predominantly because there have been a few studies that have linked autism to the community, unfortunately to the detriment of some autistic communities and advocacy groups. But I do think that there is a very important way in which autism comes out for neurodiverse users and how they navigate inceldom and romantic relationships that makes them slightly different, but they do still experience the same difference as normies. However, they do differentiate themselves between neurodiverse or from neurodiverse normies, that their experiences are subjectively worse somehow, which I think is an interesting sort of dynamic there. Two, about, are you aware of any research on female incels? Yes. I can't remember the authors' names off the top of my head, but I've got a colleague, Josh Thorburn, who does amazing work on exiting forums, who is just about to submit his PhD, and he's looking at Incelosphere spaces, predominantly, I want to say it's female dating strategy and forever alone women. There's not been a lot of research on femcells and unwanted singlehood among women with the lens of inceldom, predominantly because community spaces tend to view it as something that's male only, and also femcels don't necessarily want to associate with the masculine community. The femcel forums have also largely been taken offline, but there is some literature out there. If you want to send me an email, I can send you the PDFs that I've got, if that's helpful. And then the final thing, was there a feeling of loss when leaving the groups due to Ascension, so much so that they don't want to have sex, a relationship, because then they will lose the supportive community membership? That is a really, really interesting question. And it's a hard one to quantify because oftentimes it's sort of a silent leave for a lot of community members, especially within the main forum. You're not allowed to tell people that you've ascended because it breaks rules around bragging. So they've got this weird sort of dynamic where people are constantly yearning for ascension, but you're not allowed to actually talk about it with community members. And if you are out as having ascended within that one platform, they can ban you based on the rules that are there. So it makes it really difficult to determine whether people are actually talking about their experiences while having differential experiences. But across the more support-focused forums that I was looking at, it tended to be a positive experience, that they were sort of, they felt like their time was up. And I think this was more prevalent for users who had engaged quite a bit with community spaces where they were like, you know what, I feel good to move past this. However, there were some users in focus forums who stay, and they are formers who offer their advice and their experiences to other people, which I think is a really helpful way of showing how diverse experiences can be, while also keeping those bonds and cementing new bonds with people who are looking to leave as well. I hope that answers those, but shoot me an email for the femcel stuff and I'll send it your way.
Okay, cool. We've got a couple more in the chat as well. We've got one from Lauren K. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for this talk, Allysa. It's been super interesting. Had one question that I think you started to touch on. Now that Reddit has banned/removed some of these subreddits that appear to have served as a key platform in the Incelosphere, how, if at all, do you think this has impacted the online sphere of incels, how it functions, and the ideologies at play within it?
Thank you. Definitely, I think it's hard to say. I think because I was around when the main subreddit was active and I was lurking in there at the time, again, to age myself. And a lot of the conversations just feel transplanted from that original Reddit forum to the main forum. And a lot of the content is quite similar, particularly because the main forum doesn't have a strict moderation guidelines around content and violence and harm. I do think the sort of mass exodus in 2020, 2021 from Reddit meant that users tended to go towards other manosphere affiliated subreddits. So when Brain Cells was banned or quarantined in 2020, a lot of people tended to go to Incels Without Hate, which was then ultimately banned because those influx of users were some of the more toxic ones from Brain Cells, not all, but some who were very vocal, who then changed the discussions that were happening in the community and then resulted in the community getting banned from Reddit at that time as well. And you can actually see the trajectory of posts. I've got an archival data set that was open access, which is really helpful, but you can see how the tone of the post changed after that ban happened. So I do think it changes the topics of conversation and also changes how users engage with one another because there is this fracturing across different communities, right? The main forum is seen as like the legit space. It is this aggressively masculine space where people can wallow, but also where people can form connections around shared interests. Whereas Brain Cells was sort of that in between. It was a meme space. I struggle to call it that, but there were some sort of visual and text-based memes that came out that were good. I don't want to say good. They were appreciated by users who were in those spaces. and there were still toxic conversations that, ended up in them getting quarantined, that then sort of transplanted either to the main forum or to Incels Without Hate at the time. There's also been a few splinter subreddits like Black Pill Science where community members can go if they are really interested in engaging with the literature base that supports inceldom. And there's still Incel Exit, that is one of the main support focus forums, which is one of the ones that I've looked at. But because the mod team is so active there, the conversations tend to be a lot more helpful and critical, but not aggressive. So I do think that a lot of the aggressive content tends to be within the independent platforms that are not under larger social media giants, because those are easier to sort of subvert moderation guidelines, and also they're independently owned and they shift domain names a lot. So, you can sort of obscure the content that's happening there. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. We've got another one, just a comment from Lauren. It does feel like the evidence-based misogyny and pseudoscience content is so difficult to challenge because of that wider public availability and how far and wide it is reproduced by the men/groups you've mentioned.
Definitely. It's hard. It is hard at present to sort of work through that. I'm doing a grant-funded project on looking at support-focused spaces as informal grassroots forms of counter speech. And one of the things that I find really interesting is because there's this influx of information, a lot of our approaches in the PCVE space, so preventing and countering violent extremism space, has been to debunk, pre-bunk, or fact check. And what we're finding now is that a lot of that doesn't work because there's just so much content, but also crucially because people are taking what they need from that scientific evidence base. So even if it's proper science, I don't want to make distinctions, but like, I don't think Evo psych stuff, I don't appreciate it, but that's my own personal bias. When you see proper science around sort of individual experiences, things like height, race, weight, those all little snippets of that are used to support a wider worldview, a wider narrative around something. And it's this sort of take what you need, leave what you don't mentality. And this isn't something that's unique to the Incelosphere. I think a lot of us are guilty of it. We read headlines really quickly, we share stuff, and we're like, look at this. And we don't really fact check as much as we should. But the scope of content that is just shared in these spaces and in social media more broadly, and the volume of asynchronous communication that's happening across platforms all the time means it's so difficult to actually get a grasp on how this is used and how you can actually challenge it. So one of the things that I'm sort of looking at now is equal alternative narratives that aren't really speaking to the factual content, because a lot of the ways in which pseudoscience and evopsych stuff is being used is to support subjective lived experience, but offering people a way to interpret their life experiences in a way that is equally as attractive. Stay tuned for that because it's still in early days, but I do think it's really useful to sort of think about how we're living in almost this post-truth and post-factual thing now, especially with how governments are using misinformation. But yeah, it's a minefield out there, which makes academic research really fun to do right now.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds like an interesting project, and the AI girlfriend stuff also sounds really interesting. I think we've got an idea for a speaker whose work is also on that, so maybe.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. And then one more, this will be the last question, I think. Thank you so much for this talk. I just wanted to ask if there was something to do with my research and gauge your thoughts on how you see the discourses from the incel or manosphere spaces influencing the mainstream media's framing of women in politics, particularly in regards to Trump's re-election.
This is a great question because I wrote a GNet Insight about this after Trump was elected, which I'll share in the chat if anyone is interested. But basically, I think I'm in two camps about it because I think there's a lot of fringe content that is being platformed in mainstream spaces now that Trump has almost legitimized a lot of this content by being Trump, unfortunately. But it does feel like it's increased the permissibility and acceptability of these views. And I saw that in the aftermath of the 2016 election as well, because I was still in those spaces at the time. I was in r/the Donald, I was in r/the Red Pill for another unrelated project. And you could just see how Trump's rhetoric was like, oh, look, it's a win for male supremacism, because now we don't have to hide it anymore. We can make it visible. And now we can just barrage certain people with death threats, with saying, look, Trump's going to rape you, Trump's going to kill you, he's going to get rid of all your rights. And I saw this to a similar extent after his win in 2024. But it almost felt like it wasn't anything new. And I think that's because this gradual erosion of how we speak about women, specifically women as a wider gender category, but particular types of women, has been happening across the years. So we've seen it in the post-pandemic, I don't want to say post-pandemic, but post-lockdown world, where things felt a bit nastier, and things have continued to feel nasty online, where we've sort of legitimized speaking in newscasts about certain people. Diane Abbott is one of those people. We've seen Lawrence Fox make comments about people on daytime television. There's a lot of ways in which misogyny is mainstreamed and accepted that aren't necessarily 100% related to Trump, but what he has done is galvanize support and galvanize the visibility of this rhetoric, especially with Elon also being part of that whole situation, and Zuckerberg now caving to get rid of his content moderation policies and bring back sort of outdated ideas of it's fine to call women inanimate household objects and say they can get back in the kitchen. It's just made a lot of this misogyny that was in fringe spaces more permissible and acceptable in the mainstream discourse.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Allysa. I'm just going to wrap up now with this final slide. So yeah, just thank you everyone for coming today. Particularly thanks to Allysa for that amazing talk, and thank you for all your questions. We'd be really, really grateful if you could complete this sort of feedback form that we've just put in the chat. It's just kind of asking what you might like to see, what you enjoyed, and yeah, where we could take this seminar series next. I know there's also a few people here who are doing work in this space, so we're really looking forward to seeing how that progresses and hearing more about it. This seminar has been recorded, so we're going to post it on our YouTube channel if you want to share that with anyone. Please also follow the Shush group, our social media channels. You can use the QR code to sign up to our mailing list or check out our website and find out how you can maybe present your own work or just get engaged with the work that we're doing. But yeah, finally, one more thank you for Allysa. I'm going to do a claps sign. And yeah, thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great week.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me as well.
And the recording.